Okay. Hello, Quay. Welcome. Thank you all for joining. Good afternoon or it's good evening, depending on where you are, or maybe you're right in the middle. But welcome to my YouTube channel. Quay Louise Pam Palmater. My name is Pam Palmater. I'm a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, author, and Indigenous rights activist. I'm also a member of Ugbaganjig, which is Eel River Bar. But today, I'm coming to you from the territories of Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. And today's live event is one that is directly in response to all of the questions that you have been sending me, questions, comments, and concerns about Canada's ongoing racial discrimination against First Nations kids and families, and especially as it relates to the ongoing foster care crisis, because that's effectively what it is. And I have many of the same questions as you do. In fact, I can't remember if it was today or yesterday, but I had to call up my good friend Cindy Blackstock, of course, because I was really confused about everything, where we were and separating all the different issues. I mean, there's the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, the compensation agreement, long-term reform, there's votes at the AFN, and it all kind of gets jumbled up. And I can tell by some of the questions that have been sent in that, we've got some issues that we need to clarify. But thankfully, I don't have to be answering all these questions by myself. And just so that you know, we have our amazing, wonderful moderator here. And he's confirming we've got audio and video. He is here to make sure that we keep this a safe, respectful place. Please ask questions. Please, get clarifications. State your concerns on the live event. We welcome that. We just have to make sure that, no hateful people drop in to visit us. It usually doesn't happen. But before we get going along, I want to make sure to introduce everyone, because I feel very privileged to have them here on this live. Of course, we've got my good friend Cindy Blackstock. You've all seen her on my live YouTubes a multitude of times. She's from the Gitxsan Nation, and she's the head of the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society and helped lead the human rights complaint against Canada at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And won, by the way. Cindy, one of my most favorite things is that Cindy used Canada's own internal documents to prove that the federal government was and continues to racially discriminate against our kids. In other words, Canada knew that by racially discriminating against our kids, that our kids would be disproportionately apprehended and put in foster care or suffer in other ways, especially accessing health care. We also have someone who I have admired for a very long time. I've never had an opportunity to have him on a YouTube live. Oh, and I should tell you, Khelsilem, that once you're on my YouTube live, you're now contracted for life to be here. And I'll have to get you on my podcast too. But he is a very prominent and well-known First Nations leader. He's the current chairperson of the Squamish Nation, and he was first elected to council in 2017. He's been an official spokesperson. He's super active in all of the issues that we care about as grassroots people on the ground in terms of nonprofit housing, economic development, languages, which is so key because of all of the damage that was done. And he has been part of one of the largest Indigenous housing developments in Canadian history. So, I mean, this chairperson is one of those people who is getting things done. And his lifelong work has been focusing on all of these things that are very important to our culture, But I've also been following him recently because he's been on Twitter and social media trying to help explain to us what was happening at the Assembly of First Nations recent Chiefs Assembly, what's happening with the agreements, the votes, things like that. And I really trust his analysis because he's always had our people's best interests at heart. And I have to say, my friend, and maybe I should say my long, long, long lost friend, Hadley Friedland, who we were just talking about before this live event. I think the last time I seen her was at the Wacotowin Lodge, and we were talking about Bill C-92 and what the legislation could mean if it was passed. I literally haven't seen her in person for years, and she is too now also contractually obligated to do YouTube lives. But she's an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. And her research has always focused on Aboriginal law, so law that impacts Indigenous peoples, and then Indigenous law, so our laws and legal systems and principles and traditions, as well as she's very much focused on family law and child welfare law. So we knew she'd be a very important person to have on this live. And just, as an aside, she also has a diploma in child and youth care. So there you go. These are all experts. I'm just the chairperson, but you should also check out the Wacotowin Law and Governance Lodge. They are a dedicated research initiative that's developed to uphold our laws, Indigenous laws. And to me, that is like the wave of the future, making sure that our right to be sovereign, self-determining nations with our own laws is respected. So welcome to all of you. But before we get into things, and maybe it's just because I'm a lawyer, but we usually have disclaimers. None of us are providing legal advice, financial advice, medical advice, or personal advice. Like, that's not what this is about. This is our insight, analysis, critique, ideas, suggestions. But if you have any legal questions about the issues that we're talking about, please contact a lawyer, because we can't provide that legal advice. The other thing that's important to know, because we often get asked questions, is none of us are being paid to do this YouTube live. Sorry, guys, just there's no pay for this. And we're not sponsored by any political party or organization or corporation. We are just doing this because we want to answer all of your questions and help clarify some of the confusion, what's happened, and where do we go from here in terms of ending Canada's discrimination. Now, I want to ask all of you, Cindy, Hadley, Khelsilem, are there any other disclosures that you need to make personally, or have I covered it?
The only thing I'd say is that the Caring Society, is a party in that Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case that was the subject of that final settlement agreement that was discussed by First Nations leadership in Calgary. What that means is that even though we were not a signatory or a party to that agreement, when it came to the tribunal, because there's kind of two ticky boxes, you had to have the leadership approve it, and then it would move on to the tribunal for their approval. We would have had something to say about that.
Okay, great. And Hadley, do you want to disclose that you're from Alberta?
I thought the deal was no.
Okay. We won't hold it against you. And how about you, Khelsilem? Anything that we have to have as an official disclosure?
Just that I'm doing this work on behalf of Squamish Nation as the chairperson, and I have the support of my council to sort of speak on these issues and advocate based off the position that we've approved. So I do come as a representative of the Squamish Nation in my official capacity.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for taking the time to do this. And I know it's on a Friday night. We often have a good number of people that join us, but we have an even larger number of people that watch it afterwards. So we're going to cover a large number of questions that were sent in by social media since the Chiefs Assembly, but also prior to that. And then when I made the call out, people send in their questions. And out of respect for community members, some of them are okay with us using their first names, and some of them want to be anonymous because they worry about pushback. And here on this live, you don't have to use your name if you don't want to. So we'll try to get through all of those, plus any that come in terms of people who attend on the live. So with that all out of the way, there are so many issues right now, and there's a lot of confusion about what we're going to be talking about, what issues are left to talk about. Now, we're not going to cover the same ground that Cindy and I have in the last couple of lives, like all of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decisions and orders, like all the details. I'll post links to make sure you can go back and watch those if there's something that you think you missed. But before we get started, Cindy, just assume there's some people out there that are like me and we're all confused about what we're talking about. Is this about tribunals? Is this about settlements? Is this about votes? Like everything was mixed up in my mind. Can you just kind of clarify the individual pieces?
Yeah, so this is a legal case against the Canadian government that's still ongoing, and it's a human rights case. And back in 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which is kind of like a court, it's got the same authority. It can order the government to do stuff. It said that Canada was racially discriminating against our kids by underfunding child and family services and also structuring it in a way that just didn't make it work. Good people on the front lines were trying their very best to keep families together, but had almost no resources to do it. So everybody was being set up for failure, most importantly, the children and families. And then we had Canada saying, oh yeah, we know about Jordan's principle, which is ensuring First Nations kids can access the health, education, and social services when they need them, but we're not going to do it, the federal government said. So really, we had to take them to the tribunal, and the tribunal said, you know what, Canada, you have to do it. This isn't just about something nice to do. This is a legal requirement that you have to meet the needs of these kids. But the tribunal also did something else. They looked back at the long history of reports. You know them all, Pam, RCAP, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there's all these recommendations for changes, and the government says they'll do it, and then they don't do it, and then kids get hurt again. So they actually held on to what they call jurisdiction, which is to watch over the case to make sure the federal government does it, and they can make decisions after. So we've actually had 24 decisions since 2016. This settlement, there's a bunch of us that are involved in this case. The Caring Society and the Assembly of First Nations, we're the ones that filed it. We're called complainants. And then there's something called the Canadian Human Rights Commission. They're involved. Their job is to make sure that human rights are upheld. And then there's something called interested parties, which are groups that have particular interest in the case. Chiefs of Ontario for the Ontario 1965 Agreement, Nishnawbe Nation for remoteness in their territory. And so Canada decided that they would negotiate with Canada, or with often with itself, Canada with AFN, Chiefs of Ontario, Nishnawbe Nation, to try and come up with an agreement that would stop the discrimination in child and family and make sure it never happened again. And none of us, most importantly, the First Nations themselves, did not see the agreement until it was released on July 11th of this summer. And so, and it wasn't even complete, Pam. There were pieces rolling in right to, I think, days before the Chiefs were put in a position of voting for it. And even then, it wasn't a complete agreement. So, there was a lot of scrambling around by First Nations. They knew how important this was, trying to get independent information, trying to reach out to their own lawyers, their own experts, so that leadership could make a decision about this. Because this was critical. Because what it would have done is it would have gotten rid of all those tribunals orders that have helped us get things like, safe buildings for kids and families, prevention services, and all these other important things. Those would all go away, and it would be replaced by this agreement.
Well, thanks for that, because that clarification is really important, because I got a lot of questions from people thinking that what the Chiefs were voting on was compensation, that they were kind of going back and dealing with that. So, Mr. Chairperson, you're a First Nations leader. You've been advocating on this issue. I have been watching everything that you're saying on social media. And I believe you were also at the Chiefs Assembly, the Assembly of First Nations Chiefs Assembly, that included a vote on this issue. Now, there were some commentators in the media that seemed to suggest this was only about money. But the concerns that were had wasn't just about money, was it?
Well, it was interesting. So I was at present for the recent assemblies, July, and then the recent one in October, even the ones prior to that, that often brought this issue up to talk about. And I would say that for many of the proponents of the final settlement agreement that was proposed and ultimately rejected, their rhetoric and their messages really focused on the money. They focused on the billions of dollars that have been sort of notionally agreed to. And they were using the threat of this money not being there if we and kind of fear mongered around the money issue to the Chiefs. And it was multiple days of them sort of trying to posit this fear tactic, I would say, fear mongering, that if you don't sign on to this, we're going to lose the money. And then there might be a federal election. Conservative government can come in and they could say not fund this agreement if we don't sign it now. So there was a lot of focus on the money. But when you listened to the regional experts, because we had the ability to change the agenda and have experts from all of the regions across the country speak to the agreement, when you listen to the chiefs from a number of regions, including regions like British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Quebec, and the Maritimes that had sent letters, their regional chiefs had sent letters to the national chief saying that the secretive nature of the negotiations, the lack of updates, the details, the concerns around what was being negotiated. So there was a number of regions, and they all pointed to a long list of concerns with the final settlement agreement that had nothing to do with the funding aspect, although that was a concern as well. It was a concern around the implementation of this agreement. It was a concern around the accountability of the agreement. It was a concern around the funding commitment. So there is a 10-year funding commitment. There was a notional commitment from Canada to work towards the ending of discrimination, not a commitment to end discrimination.
Mhm.
And there was no commitment beyond the 10 years. And then in response to sort of the fear mongering around, well, what if Pierre Poilievre becomes prime minister? Conservative government will be harder to negotiate with, or they won't, they'll never sign a deal of this magnitude. It's only the Liberals that will do something in their great hearts to help First Nations children, which is not the case. And the reality is that in the agreement, the final settlement agreement that was negotiated, it included clauses that said that the funding for the implementation was still subject to the annual budgetary approval process. It was still subject to federal approval on an annual basis. So going through Treasury Board, going through the budget approval by Parliament, it was still subject to that. So this idea that, well, if we don't sign on to it now, we're going to have a harder time getting the same deal in the future with the government changes, kind of doesn't really make sense when you look at the fact that even if we signed this agreement, which had all of these terrible clauses around implementation and accountability, and then election happens, a future government could still decide to not fund the agreement and still decide not to commit to the clauses. On the implementation, there was a lot of concerns expressed by regions like BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Quebec, the Maritimes, that the implementation and the structure of the implementation, so there's all these sort of implementation committees and working groups that would get appointed. Canada still played a significant role in choosing the head of those implementation committees. They tried to create space where they said, oh, we're going to actually open up representation for the regions who aren't represented, because as Cindy had outlined, NAN and Chiefs of Ontario are both parties to the agreement and to the negotiations. So they were given equal status within the implementation to the Assembly of First Nations, which left out all the other regions that don't have that same level of representation. So there was questions around that. There's questions around all the different committees that are required to be appointed and who appoints them and what's the process for appointing them. And really a lack of accountability or connection to the First Nations leadership and the experts to advise on what implementation looks like. So implementation had a lot of errors and a lot of problems. And then you get to the accountability piece. As Cindy highlighted, and I think this is one of the big risks, is that it proposed removing the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal as playing a role going forward on disputes. If there was implementation and say Canada was not fulfilling its obligation under the agreement, we would no longer, First Nations would no longer be able to go to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to address the lack of compliance. There was a dispute resolution mechanism that was spoken to, and there was parties and processes for how that would be set up, but it wouldn't have the same strength or authority that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has. And so it makes sense why Canada wants to get out of the authority of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. They've had their butts kicked time and time again there, to be honest. They've failed to meaningfully implement and work with First Nations on the implementation of a lot of these issues. They have not honored the spirit and intent of a lot of the orders that have been issued on that. So we understand why Canada would want to get out of it. We don't understand why the AFN and the other parties would agree to surrendering that accountability mechanism that holds Canada accountable, especially when we've collectively, First Nations across the country, have been through numerous agreements where Canada has failed to uphold their obligations going back, and not even just hundreds of years, the last 20 years where that's been the case. So the money issue, I think, was there, and there's questions around whether that's the right amount to cover the ending of discrimination, both in terms of prevention and postvention, in terms of the services that need to be provided. There's a lot of questions around that as well. But I would say that the chiefs and the leadership was really focused on, is this agreement going to help end the discrimination, yes or no? And the contents of that agreement spoke to, I think, reasonably, the chiefs and proxies and leadership said, I don't think that this is a good agreement that's going to help us end the discrimination against our children. And it's not a good agreement to sign with Canada at this point. There's room for improvement, and we're committed to improving that agreement as long as Canada is willing to as well.
Well, I think that has got to be the best, most direct and simplest explanation that I have heard, because, the media, sometimes they try to do a really good job, but, when you start putting politics and mixing everything else in there, it really confuses a lot of people. Now, I just want to stay with you for a minute, because one of the other things that I heard in the media, you heard some people making statements saying, oh, the chiefs just voted to keep the status quo. They voted against the agreement and just walked away. But the chiefs didn't just vote against the agreement. Weren't there some resolutions that were passed?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think that what's been challenging is, I think, some of the inflammatory rhetoric and some of the sort of insinuations that have been put out by, certain First Nations leaders in the media have clouded the discussion. They've insinuated, motives that I think are inappropriate or incorrect. And it's true. So there was a resolution put on the floor to approve the agreement. That was the first resolution that was sort of put forward. The AFN has a rule that you have to achieve 60% of those in the room to be in favor in order for a resolution to pass. And the first resolution that called for approval of the agreement was rejected. Only 35% of the chiefs and proxies that were present voted in favor of it. 65 voted against the agreement. So once that agreement was defeated, we moved on to two additional resolutions. I was the mover of one of the resolutions and co-authored the second resolution. And these resolutions spoke to, okay, if resolution one fails, what happens next? So the second resolution spoke to, okay, now that we've defeated or rejected the agreement, how do we move forward? What's the process? And so it spoke to process. It calls for a Children's Chiefs Commission to be created with representation from all the regions, including regions that have chosen to leave the AFN, because they need to be represented and included as well. It calls for a number of committees that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal created to be mandated to support this work, because the AFN has not been resourcing them or allowing them to meet. So there's implementation committees, there's expert advisory committees, there's a number of other committees that are supposed to be helping. So we sort of called on the AFN to support those groups as well. And then that Children's Chiefs Commission would then appoint a new negotiation team with new legal advisors instead of the AFN. Legal team are managing this, and the AFN's executive and national chief overseeing the negotiations, but actually to put the negotiations back in the hands of the chiefs and leadership, so that we can get this agreement done, that we can bring all the regions together to build consensus, and that we're not going to shove an agreement down the throats of chiefs, that we actually engage in a meaningful dialogue to get to consensus. So it also spoke to process around how many days the agreement needs to be shared before it get voted on, the process for engaging in feedback and allowing for feedback once we get to a new agreement. And it ultimately calls for Canada and the parties to come together to revise the final settlement agreement a bit further and come back with what we are calling a long-term reform agreement that would actually address the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders. The following resolution after that deals with substance. So there was one resolution that dealt with process, another resolution that dealt with substance. The resolution that dealt with substance outlined, here are all of the common themes of feedback of what does not work in the final settlement agreement. Here's what needs to change. In broad terms, here's all of the things that are identified as gaps and problems, and sort of outlines for the team that is going to negotiate. Here is sort of your marching orders, your mandate of what we would like you as chiefs to sort of seek to address or amend or improve upon within the agreement. And so to outline sort of 10 or 12 different items. And so one's dealing with process, one's dealing with substance. Both were approved by 97% of the room voted in favor of both those resolutions. So, so it really outlined, yes, we're saying no to this version of the agreement, but we're committed to engaging in the next steps. So at the next SCA in December, which will be an important meeting again, is it called for the terms of reference for the negotiation team to be approved by the chiefs. So I've submitted another resolution that addresses that matter, and we'll be prepared to bring forward the terms of reference. We're hoping that the regions will begin immediately to appoint their representatives to the Children's Chiefs Commission, so that we can get moving on the negotiation as quickly as possible.
Thank you for all of your work on that. I can only imagine how relieved all of the regions must feel, because it's a national issue. I don't have to tell anyone who's watching here that the discrimination of Canada against First Nations children and families, it's not just in one region or another. It really is across all regions, and we want open and transparent accountability about what's happening. So I really appreciate that you've done that. I appreciate the clarifications, because a lot of comments that I got were, how come some of the chiefs are supporting the status quo? And I was like, okay, you know what? We need to clear that up, because you didn't just vote against the agreement and walk away. It was really, hey, no, we got to go back. We've got to revisit it. We've got to make changes, and we got to make sure it's fair across the country. So I really appreciate that. Hadley, of course, I'm going to give you the toughest question of all, but there's lots of things going on here. And I know that, this all came about because of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, who, gave that initial decision, confirmed Canada was racially discriminating, and then gave order after order after order when Canada wasn't doing its part. But I can't help but think, setting aside the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, surely Canada's discrimination against First Nations kids violates other laws. I mean, there must be other laws implicated here. Like, there must be constitutional laws and other things. Can you just speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a complex question, and there's been such a good job done of making things straightforward that have a lot of complexity. So I'll do my best. One of the things I should actually just say, I guess I should have had a disclaimer that just I have not been involved in any way on the ground in the long-term settlement negotiations or the vote. So I just wanted to make that clear. So I'm really coming as sort of an outsider with a legal mind and some background. So I mean, absolutely, the hugest issue here is racial discrimination under the Canadian Human Rights Act. And maybe, I mean, before we talk about the pieces that intersect with it, I think it shows the severity of the discrimination when you look at the numbers in the settlements. Canada didn't, as pointed out, Canada didn't come out of the goodness of their heart and say, wake up one day and say, hey, we're racially discriminating. Let's do something about this. Like, we'd like to give a gift. This was hard fought, hard won. And a settlement itself is never, it's not a litigation where there's an order and there's an absolute, settlements are give and take. It's sitting at a negotiation table, right? So thinking about that, I think contextualizes the other pieces of the law. Very recently, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld C-92, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis children, youth, and families. And one of the things that they said when they were talking about that is they didn't decide on a Section 35 basis, on an Aboriginal and treaty rights basis, but they said this legislation shows Canada's intent. So now, from now on, Canada's bound by this. Canada, unless they actually come back and rescind this legislation. So Canada is bound to act as if, and I thought that was really powerful language. They need to act as if the right to self-determination over specifically child and family services, they must act as if that is enshrined in the Constitution, a recognized and affirmed Section 35 right. So I think when you take that and you put that against discussions around long-term settlement agreement, you want to look at it that way. So Canada is bound to be at these negotiations acting as if. The Supreme Court has said that. Are they at the table acting as if? What does that mean? What does it mean with C-92? That's sort of the shorthand for the act. One of the things when this, I think last time, Pam, you and I got together and we were talking about what will this act mean. Naomi Metallic at the time wrote a piece and she said, we have to be careful because if the funding isn't connected to this recognition and affirmation of jurisdiction, really it's just saying First Nations people will administer poverty, right? So I think when you look at those intersections, I don't want to say it becomes more important because I actually think there's nothing more important than the children and nothing more important than making sure they're not being racially discriminated against and they have a chance to live and grow up in families and communities. But what I want to say is when you bring these intersections in, I feel like you have rights coming from several directions, from those individual personal rights to be free of racial discrimination, to broader, what are often termed as collective rights and constitutional rights under Section 35.
These are all such important factors. When we were all talking about it, sometimes there were people saying, wait a second, what about C-92? Oh, what about this Supreme Court of Canada case? Isn't Canada supposed to be acting in a certain way? So I'm really glad that you raised that because it's, in addition to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders, there's all these other legal obligations. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Hadley, was UNDRIP. Because when I read the reference to the Supreme Court of Canada on C-92, I found it very interesting that in the beginning, not only did it say that this legislation was part of Canada's commitment to reconciliation, but so was UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So if we just think about it generally, doesn't free, prior, and informed consent and the right to be self-governing over our kids and the right to enact our own laws, shouldn't that kind of inform this whole process?
I think that's really important because the Supreme Court did say very strongly, up until this reference case, we haven't had clear direction from the Supreme Court. But we did have, again, the federal government pass an act, UNDRIPA, that says it's important to align laws with the UNDRIP. And the Supreme Court did speak really strongly talking about, Indigenous children, the well-being and raising of Indigenous children is a core and central part of that Indigenous self-government that the UNDRIP sets out to protect minimum standards around. So I think that can include free, prior, and informed consent. But I think almost more so. I'm not, again, not to diminish that, but I think almost more so. I mean, the Supreme Court said Canada has made international commitments. They combed through the UNDRIP. They identified several, the preamble, but several articles. I haven't pulled up, so I'm a lot better. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, bear with me. But I didn't read them out. The clauses. But at least 6 places in the UNDRIP where they said, the well-being, the ability to care for Indigenous children is central to this protected right. So I think that, again, emphasizes how important it is that it is possible to fund this without racial discrimination.
So important. And Khelsilem, I mean, there's a lot of legal issues involved here. You must have some ideas around all of this, what's implicated.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of legal issues, and I can speak from my own perspective as a leader of the Squamish Nation. We're in the process right now of reasserting or reclaiming our jurisdiction around child and family services for our nation. So we're in the process of developing our own child family law that would be enacted through enacted as affirmed by C92 and the federal and provincial laws that affirm our law once we enact it. So we are in the process of developing that because we have, for Squamish Nation, been slowly reclaiming our jurisdiction in this area for the last 30 years. And there's a number of First Nations in BC and Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario that are starting to do the same. But one of the things that I think is really important to connect this to is there is these legal obligations, there are these legislative obligations, and there are also these charter and constitutional obligations. One of the things that I think that was really eye-opening for me at the recent Special Chiefs Assembly was during a presentation from AFN Legal when they were sort of making the case to sign on to this final settlement agreement, when they were trying to pitch to the chiefs, here's what it means, here's the terms of the agreement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was a point where AFN's Legal had said to the chiefs, this is not an agreement about First Nations rights. This is an agreement about a program and reforming a federal program. It is not a rights-based agreement. Rights are to be addressed through C92 and through nations enacting their own laws to reclaim jurisdiction however they want. This agreement only deals with a federal program that was administered between these time periods. And so they kind of emphasized it a bit more and said the chiefs need to understand that this isn't intended to be a rights-based agreement. And it struck me because I was sitting with a number of chiefs and we all kind of said, when they said that, it really revealed to me why we ended up in the place that we're in. Because if that's the mentality that the lawyers and the AFN was operating on this entire time, it makes sense that they would come up with an agreement that does not address the long-term discrimination of our children. It makes sense that they would come up with an agreement that has so many gaps and holes in it because they were approaching it from this. We're just trying to reform a federal program. That's it. It's not about anything more than that. It's just a federal program that the feds administered, and we're trying to reform that. We're going to increase the funding here a little bit. We're going to change some of the processes for how funding is distributed, but we're just dealing with a funding program. And I think that was a fundamental flaw in the process, and a fundamental flaw in all the processes with the AFN. Like the Assembly of First Nations, when it was created in 1981, 1982, that was a time period where we were dealing with, this sort of a certain type of assault on First Nations rights, and we had to come together as First Nations across the country to defend those rights. But where we've landed 30, 40, 50 years later is the Assembly of First Nations was never created to be this organization that was supposed to be leading these complex, comprehensive class action settlement negotiations, comprehensive reform negotiations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the structure of the AFN they don't have policies, they don't have procedures, they don't have any structure around, okay, we're going to engage in a negotiation with Canada on behalf of First Nations. Here's the process we should engage in internally amongst ourselves to get to a support for a final agreement. What is our own internal process to getting to free, prior, and informed consent? None of that is established. So at no point, like at multiple points through this negotiation, it was chiefs having to take our own action to try and ensure that the process the AFN would use would be the proper process, because they were going off on their own and doing their own thing, and that's how we ended up in this place. But it stems from that mentality. It's this, for me at least, and I feel like I can say this, is it's a very arrogant, very condescending attitude that they know best, the chiefs don't. We can't include the chiefs. We have to keep everything in the dark. We have to be secretive about it, because if we include them, they won't understand, and we have to bring them something at the end. And even the fact that they tried to bring an agreement and then disclose it at the last minute and say, we're going to call a meeting within 45 days so you can sign on to this. And there's no chance to give any feedback or make any amendments. We just have to sign on to it. It speaks to a lack of respect for the leadership who have been elected by the communities to take care of their interests. And it speaks to, I think, a flawed understanding in the process that got us to where we're at today.
Cindy, I can't help but ask, just a program? What about the rights of these kids and families? Like, what is with that? Surely there's more laws involved than just a program.
Yeah, that was one of the, there was reasons why we weren't in that negotiation room. And for me, the tribunal made a legal finding about these children's human rights. They repeatedly made reference to UNDRIP, respecting the individual rights of these children and the collective rights of these children. So that is what is at issue. This is not just kind of quote reform of a program. This is in order to ensure Canada stops discriminating, as it was ordered to do by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and still has not done. In fact, in my view, that agreement, the way it was drafted, would have allowed for Canada to discriminate against children, and that would not have been a breach of the agreement. Because as Khelsilem has noted, there was a section in there that allowed for Canada to have all the money, like this big marquee of $47.8 billion. Well, there wasn't really money in the bank account. It was an announcement. And every year, it said in the agreement, the federal government would make that money, the level, the term, subject to parliamentary appropriation and any other undefined approval process. And as Khelsilem is talking about this important transition, and so is Hadley, towards self-government, towards a reclamation of First Nations making decisions about their kids, loving their kids in their traditional ways, the governance of this went in a complete opposite direction. And that would have been that had First Nations leadership approved this, they would have had no decision making after that. It would have gone to a secret committee. And, like one of the things that I feel strongly about, Pam, is that secrecy is often good for adults. It's not good for kids. And especially because we're dealing with First Nations that have diversity. They have diversity in aspirations, cultures, contexts, etc. It's vital that they're a part of this process of upholding the human rights and the Indigenous rights of these particular children and their families. That is the legal standard. And it's not good enough to try and hold Canada accountable. It's quite literally our job to make sure that they're being held to account.
I guess the moral of the story is it's not just a program. It is actually a rights-based issue. They have human rights. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal said they have human rights. So of course it's rights-based, if not for anything else but that. And, I think Spirit Bear would be upset with me if I didn't ask you this question, but how does this impact kids? So it's not like because we're at the negotiating table that, oh, this is great. There's been these tribunal orders. There's no more discrimination. So now we're just talking about a program. But I mean, we see articles in the news every day about people whose access to Jordan's principal benefits could be cut off. So, like, how does this impact kids? Help us understand how significant this is and why it's important that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has retained jurisdiction over it.
Yeah, so this particular agreement was on child and family. However, it was, in my view, a precedent for what was coming on Jordan's Principle, because the parties actually said, Canada and AFN in particular, have said they plan to negotiate a similar agreement on Jordan's Principle by 2025. So let's begin with the stuff on child protection. So one of the big pieces that we have all collectively been struggling to achieve is ensuring that families have a range of options and supports available to them, so that we can get in there in the family, and when the family's struggling in the earlier stages, and try to stabilize things in that family before things become a crisis, children are unsafe, and they have to be removed and placed with alternative care, which hopefully it's going to be extended family. Sometimes we have children with high special needs and they need to go to different places. So we just received the order in late 2018 that Canada had to fund those prevention services. They should have done that in 2016, but they just didn't do it. So we had to bring them back to court and force them to do it. And those monies were just starting to roll out. We were starting to see programs in the communities to support families better, etc. And then this agreement, what it would have done is it would have taken the amount of money that a First Nations agency would need to operate. It would have split it with First Nations, but not provided the First Nations with the capacity building money to get out there and talk to community, build programs, hire staff, etc. So you would end up with an underfunded agency trying to serve these children. You would have a First Nation that in most cases wouldn't have capacity to do it. And you'd have kids and families in the middle struggling with the realities of trying to stay together in the child welfare crisis. And I have to say, like in the opioid crisis, that to me did not set up for success. Unpredictability like that, a chaos in the system, is never good for children. And then one of the other areas we talked about is we struggled to get post-majority supports for young persons who are in care up until age 26. Well, in one community, that would have meant 560 young people would have had their program closed, but there wasn't another program to pick it up. Like, that's the kind of thing that would happen. On Jordan's Principle, I mean, you probably were watching the news. You're a McMaw, and so was this mom today.
Yeah.
Like, the non-compliance by the federal government on Jordan's Principle is creating heartbreaking situations. There we had a loving mom who has cerebral palsy, who was tragically hit by a car and had additional mobility issues. And just to give you a sense of how much this mom loves her kids, lives on a two-story thing, and the three children also have special needs, by the way. But before she was hit by this truck, she would literally just push herself up the stairs so that she could care for her children on the second level. That's the kind of love that there is in many of our families. And when she was in a car accident, she couldn't do that anymore. So she needed some support to look after the kids, because they're all special needs, while she recovers from this car accident. And Jordan's Principle was there. Canada did fund it, but then Canada said, time's up. And time's up without any other support. This mom has done nothing wrong. She's doing everything she can to, care for her kids. And then the department, it looks like very much like the department, the federal government cuts off the services, and they think, oh, well, yeah, the children will be at risk, so let's call in child welfare. Well, that's not the response. The response is make sure the family has the supports they need. And by the way, if you're listening to this and you think, well, it's probably cheaper just to put the kids in care, your answer to that is wrong. It is not only, these types of decisions are not only bad for kids, it's bad economically too. And I feel this whole case, Pam, as you heard me talk about it before, is one of the biggest public policy boondoggles in history. Like, the federal government just had to pay that compensation of $23 billion. Had they listened to experts back in 2000, we would have fixed this problem back then, and there wouldn't have been any victims. They wouldn't have had to pay the $23 billion. So this idea of taking on the cheap for kids is not good for children. It's not good for families. It's not good for the economy and all kinds of other things. It's a huge tragedy. So I just want to pay my respects to that mom, for having the courage in all those circumstances to speak out and speak out loud, because she knows there's other kids out there, like in her family, that need this help.
I feel like that case is a prime example about why we need not just the compensation, but all of the reform, why First Nations need to have control over child and family services, why there has to be so much more funding. I mean, imagine a mom losing her kids, not because she's a bad mom, but because the government is going to cut off funding. So government's going to use its own discrimination as an excuse for the kids to eventually be taken away. That just, to me, I think that is an egregious case that just shows why everything we're talking about is so important. And like one of the other things, because there's like a whole bunch of questions from people, I want to make sure that we get to them, but Cindy, one of the questions, I should say 20 of the questions are comments that you and I have gotten on all of the other lives saying, hey, I've been applying for Jordan's principal and no one responds. Or, hey, I've been applying for this for my kids and they're saying no. And so there's this sense by many of our community members that there is an ongoing breach of Jordan's principle. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, in fact, we were hearing tragedies for the last 5 years, and that was one of the reasons why we left the negotiations, because there was a framework for the negotiations that said you couldn't hold accountable Canada for its breaches of legal orders, and we were seeing it with Jordan's principle in heartbreaking ways. So, for example, one of the public ones, some of you will remember, is just a few weeks ago, there was a little girl in Burns Lake, where I was born. And she had autism. And there was a Jordan's principal request in there for more supports for her, because autistic children, some of them, they tend to wander. Well, that was held up with all kinds of red tape by the federal government, that request. The little girl wandered into the bush and she was, in there for days. Thankfully, to the heroic efforts of the nation and her family and the other emergency responders, they were able to find her in time. But that's not necessarily the case. So all this to say, we actually filed a non-compliance motion against Canada. And we're supported by letters from leadership, from First Nations organization, from parents. Parents have generously said that, yes, you can use my story. We just won't identify the parent, but because people are just really aware that Jordan's principle is sacred, it does a lot of good, but Canada is backpedaling. And it's important to keep in mind this whole Canada coming to the table with this agreement for the chiefs to vote on CFS and say, here it is, trust us, was happening at the same time when they were violating Jordan's principle and facing non-compliance orders before the tribunal.
I mean, how on earth can they expect us to trust them? And we shouldn't actually have to trust anyone. It should be there in black and white. There's a ton of questions, and some of them are directed specifically at each one of you. Feel free to add additional information if we haven't covered it all. But Khelsilem, Melissa has asked a really good question. She's very concerned about this secret committee that was proposed, about whether community members would ever know what was happening, whether they would get information. She wants to know what you think. Like, she's very worried that this could possibly happen. Do you think now, given, you can't promise anything, but given what you know about what the chiefs have voted on and the new resolutions to renegotiate, can you talk about her concerns? Because she is very concerned. She does want to know what's happening on a governance basis going forward.
No, it's a really good question. And, one of the issues that is at the heart of, I think, the negotiation process, and Cindy's spoken to this a little bit, is so in the process, there was what was called an agreement in principle that was signed by the parties, including the AFN and Canada. And that agreement in principle included clauses that said that the negotiations had to happen on a confidential basis. And so it precluded, or at least the AFN's lawyers suggested, it precluded them from being able to share information or disclose information. And then similar clauses were baked into the agreement in terms of the transparency or the openness of a number of these implementation committees that were then called for. So people could get appointed to it. And they might not even have decision-making power, but they're not able to report on or communicate the voting decisions of, say, some of its members. the way that certain regions, if they were appointed to how did they vote, none of those things would be made public. This is similar to the executive committee of the AFN. When the national chief and the executive committee vote, we as chiefs don't know what they're voting on. They could say one thing outside and go into the doors and vote another way. They go in camera a lot because they don't want it, their constituents, their chiefs in their region to know how they voted. So similar types of processes were baked into the agreement. Not to, and I guess to think a little bit towards the future and what's possible. There are a number of organizations, both provincially and multi-provincially and then across the country, that First Nations have established. First Nations run organizations that are separate from the AFN, that can deliver service, that can deliver programs, that can deliver funding and different mechanisms. So we take it out of Indigenous Services Canada. What one lawyer said about this final settlement agreement is that it was constructed as this kind of like, let's make INAC great again kind of format of just reform INAC, as opposed to transferring and devolving the authorities and powers of INAC and actually putting it in the hands of First Nations. So there's different models that exist. There's different kinds of secretariats that could be created, a national secretariat with regional secretariats. There's regional organizations that could take on some of this work. Whereas most of what was proposed was that the AFN would still play a role in decision-making on a lot of the implementation. The other plaintiffs would as well. For example, the AFN, Chiefs of Ontario, NAN, they all had the ability to appoint people to the implementation committee. Canada played a role of appointing the chair. So it wasn't even the parties that got to appoint the chair. Canada appoints the chair. And then they, at the last minute, tried to amend the agreement to say, okay, actually, we're going to increase representation to other regions who can sit on the committee and provide advice and input. But again, the decision making is still held by the parties, not all the regions. So, I just think that better is possible. I don't think we have to settle for less. Our children deserve better. And it's unfortunate that we've gotten to this place. But I think that in the next few months, it'll be really important for the regions to get their appointees ready to go to start doing work, pull up their sleeves and get going. And a number of regions, I think, are. It'll be really important for Canada to engage on a good faith basis. I think Canada was probably really disappointed because they were probably going to make off, cents on the dollar with that final settlement agreement on the money side. And then they're off the hook on the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal side. And the battle in Ottawa, as far as I understand and what I know from my relationships and connections and conversations, is, there are people on the inside of, say, the federal Liberal Party that are sort of sympathetic, or they sort of understand some of the context, and they're trying to, they'll say, I'm doing my best. It remains to be seen if that's true. The real problem, though, is that when things hit Treasury Board and they get into the finance ministry, that's where Indigenous rights, in terms of the implementation or the recognition, do or die. Because somebody gets to Treasury Board and they say, well, the price tag is too much, or we have other priorities, or we have other things to focus on. And so they start looking at the price tag, and it gets to Treasury Board, and that's where the problems lie. So I think the challenge is going to be, we're going to have to be dealing with Canada on a good faith basis to negotiate a better agreement. But then they're going to have to be highly effective at getting the support of Cabinet and of Treasury Board, and to do a good job of convincing the powers that be within the federal government that this is something to sign on to. And that's going to take leadership from the Prime Minister. That's going to take leadership from Patty Hajdu as the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. That's going to take leadership from a number of the influential caucus members and ministers within Cabinet to push through a fair and reasonable and impactful agreement that is negotiated in good faith between the parties.
Such an important point, the political will aspect of this. It's not just like randomly having trust. It really is. There's got to be a commitment and political will to do this. Hadley, I'm going to combine some of these questions because they all relate to UNDRIP. So I've got a question around jurisdiction, that if we were using UNDRIP as a guide, shouldn't it be First Nations that have the actual governing jurisdiction over these things? And then the other question, which is semi-related, is shouldn't the chiefs have had more time and a complete agreement before they were asked to vote on it if we were going to respect free, prior, and informed consent. So it's really two things, like who should have the governance and shouldn't we be considering free, prior, and informed consent a little bit differently than what we saw?
My internet is cutting in and out a bit here.
Oh, did you hear the
Can
question?
you hear me or no?
Yeah.
I heard the question and then
Okay.
Okay. So
Okay.
if I have the question right, I think looking at the UNDRIP, and looking at, I will also say, including in Section 35, including in the Supreme Court reference, a real clear recognition of Indigenous peoples' jurisdiction over self-governance, including child and family services. So I think it really comes back to what Khelsilem said, which is, what does that implementation look like, and how does that happen in a way that actually upholds and recognizes the rights? And absolutely, the first question needs to be, who are the rights holders, and how are those rights holders involved in the conversation? And in a lot of ways, I think, this entire conversation, what we really hear is we need more communication on both sides of this negotiation. There needs to be more communication within, and there needs to be more accountability, not less, to be able to uphold and implement these rights.
So important. And, I've got another question, and I'm not sure exactly who to ask. I'm sure you all know the answer, but maybe this is a Cindy and or Khelsilem question. I'm not sure, but it relates to capital. I couldn't answer this question, but clearly there's some technicians on the ground in our communities asking questions around capital. Their primary concern, I guess, or the advisory work they were doing for their chief, was around, what are we going to get out of capital? Will these be actual costs? And so I don't know how to answer that question, or even if I'm asking it right, but maybe Cindy, you could take a stab at it first.
So right now we actually have one of those non-compliance orders at the time when Canada breaches orders and we go back to the tribunal. One of them is on capital, and it requires Canada to pay the actual cost of child and family service capital. And when we're talking about capital, just for folks out there, like you've been to some of these buildings in the community that were trying to provide child and youth services. Sometimes there wasn't even a space to provide it, but often it was like an old house that was done. Sometimes it was a trailer. We needed spaces that are honoring for children and families, that really bring the strength of their culture in there and are child safe. And that's why the capital was so important. It's kind of a chicken and egg. You can't fund prevention services if you have nowhere to offer them, so on down the line. So the tribunal ordered the actual cost of that. But under the proposed final settlement agreement that was voted down by the chiefs, it would have been a fixed amount. And we actually don't know how that fixed amount was calculated. What we've heard is the assumption from the department was one capital project per nation for 5 years. Well, I've been out there visiting many First Nations, and the needs are greater than that. I would have been really concerned about the capital piece being in place. One other thing, I just want to pick up a thread from the earlier conversation. When we talk about AFN, I just want to say that, we've had some of the regional chiefs speak out about this process as well, saying that they too are concerned. And my understanding, Khelsilem's an expert on the structure of AFN, but really those regional chiefs make up the board of AFN. And yet they too have expressed some concerns about the way that this went down, and are trying their best, I think, to try and make sure that leadership's direction on these resolutions is fully fulfilled, because it'll set up for success for kids much better than what we had on the floor before.
Khelsilem, can I just ask you about capital? Because I've worked on enough First Nations to know that if it was one project per First Nation, that wouldn't address the capital needs for many. Do Is that a correct assessment? I mean, I haven't been on every First Nation, but surely capital's got to be pretty significant.
It is significant. There's a massive, infrastructure and capital deficit for First Nations across the country. And the really sad thing about this, and I mean, I kind of just spoke to this a little bit, but to kind of repeat the point, I guess, is Canada knows, like they've done their own analysis. They see the amount of requests that come in. They know what the total ask is. Even let's say take something like housing for on reserve. Federal government plays a role in providing funding for on reserve and infrastructure. They know what the deficit is. So they know that it's to the order of magnitude of 16, 17, 18 billion. And then they go through the process and get to Treasury Board, and then Treasury Board says, okay, we'll give you 1.2 over 6 years or whatever. So Canada knows the true cost. They have a whole team of analysts and lawyers that know what the true cost of these things are. And they have a line where they're willing to negotiate the dollar value because they know that, just like any negotiation, they're trying to get out of paying the true cost as much as possible. And this is where it becomes really difficult for First Nations because it becomes a challenge to, do you take the settlement now and get something today that you can build off of, or do you try to keep going until potentially a better opportunity comes? And it is a hard decision. It is very hard and difficult, and I get why some nations would say let's take it now because I can build off, I can use it now. And that was the comment that we heard. A lot of the AFN was like, if from the people who are proponents of the agreement, like, I need money now, I need this settlement now, I need this funding to flow now, I need these things now. And we said, for me, I said, I totally understand that, I totally get it. Unfortunate, I get that. I come from a First Nation where we live in an urban center, and we make significant revenue from our land leases that we have in our urban area. So a nation like Squamish has a bit more resources. And I get why First Nations that might be a bit more desperate or have less resources are desperate to see something move forward. But again, it goes to, I think, the problems with the way that this whole negotiation structure was set up. The fact that even despite the settlement agreement that was voted down, Canada is still required under the CHRT orders to start doing things today, which they are not doing. They don't need to wait for this agreement to be approved. There's things that they can be doing now, and they're not doing them. So the capital is an issue, and it goes back to my point, which is, at the end of the day, it's a political issue for the powers that be within government, and it's Treasury Board and Cabinet that is so offside. And the knowledge gap is there. Like, the number of MPs or cabinet ministers that understand these issues, like, their knowledge is this. All they see is the briefing note saying 56 billion or whatever. And why would we spend that much money on this? I don't get what, they don't understand it. Just in the same way the public doesn't, right? The public might not have the knowledge there, and so they're electing people that don't have the knowledge there. And this is where I think the advocacy that many are doing to try to raise issues and educate is so important, because it'll be important for the political leadership in Ottawa to understand this and understand that if they don't make deals now, it's going to be more expensive down the road.
These are such important points. And one of the fears, I mean, these are legitimate fears, because Cindy and I have done lives before. And the consistent question over and over and over again is, okay, I mean, there was a lot of concern. What happens if the Chiefs don't vote in favor of this proposed agreement? Does that mean there's nothing? Like, all is for naught? There's no legal protections. There's no orders in place. And Cindy, I know we've talked about it again, but for anyone who'll be watching this later, did the vote mean, okay, that's it, there's nothing, we have nothing to rely on?
No, and in fact, the large portion of that money that was announced was already in place because of Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders. So that it was actually locked in with these orders and safeguarded by these orders. I actually don't know, and I can't honestly say how they came up with 47.8. I don't know what the calculations were behind it. And as I said earlier, and I think it's worth reading it, Pam, like, I mean, I think one of the pieces that's important to know is that those who voted against the agreement did so on the basis of the text of the agreement. So if you look at it way in the back of this thing, it's buried under Part part 25. It's called enforcement of the funding commitment. Because let's face it, Pam, you and I today on this show, we could announce we're going to pay billions of dollars, but if no one could ever hold us account, we don't have to pay anything. And this clause was really one that would cause me to stay up at night and think about the children and worry. It says any and all funding commitments by Canada or amendments agreed to by the parties. That's something else that the chiefs couldn't amend this agreement. Only those who signed it could. In this final settlement agreement, remain subject to annual appropriation by the Parliament of Canada or other necessary processes required by the Government of Canada, and those are not defined. So that's a lot of loopholes there on these funds. And what I felt I was heartbroken by, and I totally get, like, people are in desperate situations. There's a new thing called opioid orphans, where children are losing both parents to the opioid crisis. That people are in desperate or want to make a desperate decision. They see the pain in their communities. They're trying to do their best. But with this kind of loophole, this could be in a 1-year funding agreement. And then what do you say to your kids in year 2, in year 3, year 4, and so on down the line? And keep in mind, this was a 10-year agreement, but 1 year it was already underway. So it's actually only 9 years. And so even if, let's say, if Canada fulfilled everything it was supposed to fulfill, at the end of the 9 years, we would be back to square one. We'd have no way of enforcing against Canada that they don't discriminate. You would have to bring a brand new complaint. And this one's been going on for 18 years and was a lot of hefty lifting by a lot of amazing people, including First Nations leadership and these experts on the ground. And I don't think it's realistic to expect people to have to do that again. And most importantly, the worst thing about this whole case when it was being tried is children were suffering in the meantime while we're trying to hold Canada accountable. And so I don't want to ever see that again. I can just say for myself, that's just not good enough.
No kidding. And I just keep thinking, like, of all of the questions that, people are asking, and sometimes they don't have the questions until we're actually talking about it and they're thinking about it. So Hadley, a lot of people are asking, is the only way forward litigation, or is it litigation and negotiation, or is it negotiation first and litigation, or do the orders from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal mean anything in the interim?
I think Cindy has pointed out that they do. I think the challenge with litigation and negotiation, parties are at the table and they're looking for incentive. And I think it's been pointed out. And there needs to be way in negotiation that are balancing power differentials. And Canada holds a lot of power here. So I think one of the things about the litigation, about the Canadian Human Rights orders, Tribunal's orders, is that does provide a little bit of a stick, kind of carrot and stick of saying, stay at the table, negotiate something. I think what litigation is not good at is coming up with complex, sophisticated answers to complex, systemic problems like this. So that's where negotiation shines. But then you're in the issues of that give and take of negotiation and how each party is coming forward. I again think, how is Canada coming to the table? Are they coming with acting as if? Are they coming centering the well-being of Indigenous children? I think that's essential, but I think it's still possible. I think there were a lot of good people around the table, but as pointed out here, there weren't all the people that needed to be influencing those conversations, right? And needed to be having a voice in that, and thinking about the impact in each region, right, for First Nations. So I think there is still hope. I think this negotiation doesn't need to be over. And Cindy, I think I'm quoting you from article you talked about afterwards. if Canada is saying this was take it or leave it, this is all or nothing, that's not acting in the honor of the crown. That's not acting as if, or in good faith, in my opinion. So I think Canada needs to come back to the table. There's these resolutions are set up in a way where that communication, that crucial communication and consent, has a different picture, and I think it's absolutely possible to move forward here.
I'm so glad you keep bringing us back to the Supreme Court of Canada judgment around Canada has to act as if the, C-92 and the powers within there, it's already in Section 35. And, Cindy reminds us, well, shouldn't we be acting as if the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has made a decision about human rights and has made all of these orders? Because if it takes a year or 2 years or more, they certainly shouldn't be in violation of these orders. Like, our kids shouldn't suffer because politicians can't get their acts together. But Khelsilem, I want to ask you, what's a good way to go forward? Do you think that we can come to a negotiated settlement? I mean, I know we all hope to, but is there a possibility that we have to go back to the tribunal, or we have to go and litigate something bigger? I mean, surely all of the parties would rather negotiate this.
Yeah, I would say there's some things that I think only time will tell. For example, it's not clear to us in regions like, say, BC, where we are not parties to the negotiation, like, say, Chiefs of Ontario or NAN are in Ontario. I think, to be honest about it, it felt this way. I don't know for sure because we don't know the exact numbers, but it felt very much like Ontario was voting in favor of the agreement and most of the other regions weren't. So I think, how to proceed to include the voices of Ontario. I think, many of the proponents were from Ontario. They had passed resolutions in the weeks prior at both the Chiefs of Ontario and at NAN in support of the agreement, although those weren't unanimous support. I think the vote at NAN was quite divided. There was a long meeting at the Chiefs of Ontario, as I understand it, to arrive at an agreement on the resolution that was passed. So, and even the comments from the minister, for example, I've talked about and referenced, we're committed to working with the Chiefs of Ontario and with the Ontario region and the regions that want to move forward. So there was kind of, strange language. We've also seen commitments or, public statements of commitments to getting to the table and sort of waiting for the AFN to decide what its next steps were. So, it's hard to predict. Our hope is that Canada behaves honorably and comes back to the table. I think the problem that I have, or the worry that I have, is that there are bureaucrats within Canada, or even political leaders within Canada, that sort of look at this and sort of look down on the Indigenous people because we didn't have our act together. Why can't we come together to support something that was historic and amazing and all this kind of stuff? And I just really have to push back on it, because none of this would have happened this way if Canada had done its proper process and its proper due diligence to arrive at this process. Canada is the one that built this bed and is now laying in it. It goes back to, if Canada, one of the letters that Squamish Nation sent to Canada in August was outlining our concerns with the process in which this agreement was being put forward and the lack of consultation by Canada with First Nations. Canada should have been doing its own consultation with nations. It should have been its own listening tour and hearing the feedback directly. Instead, we got this watered down report from the AFN that said, oh, we heard to the Chiefs, here's 10 changes we're making to the agreement. They were all cosmetic. If Canada had actually gone out and done its own research and had done its own engagement, they would have heard the same feedback and the same issues, and they could have made the choices to say, we would also heard from the Chiefs, they would like these changes in the agreement to make it an agreement that they could sign on to. There's so many things that they could have done, but they've chosen not to for whatever reason, and I don't fully understand why. But at the end of the day, I think First Nations leadership are holding the highest integrity in this process. to say that we are fighting for the best possible deal that we can get for our children to end the discrimination. We're ready and willing to engage honorably and on good faith. If it takes us sitting in a room for 2 weeks, 10 hours a day to get it done, then let's do it. This doesn't have to take years and years and years. It's about commitment. It's about your attitude, and it's about your work ethic. And we need an attitude and a work ethic from Canada that tells us you're in this as much as we are. You're ready to do the work as much as we are to resolve these issues and to move forward. And then it could be something we celebrate. Then it could be something that we can say we achieved something that all the parties are comfortable with and happy to move forward with. And we got to get there. We have to get there. And I think First Nations leadership is ready to get there. I really look towards Ottawa and say, where are you guys? When are you going to step up?
Yeah, well, and I like that you're hopeful. And I was very worried about this whole process as I saw it, unraveling and reading what I had of the agreement. It wasn't all of it. But then when I saw the majority of chiefs say, you know what? No, this doesn't work. We need proper governance. We need to do right by our kids. We need to have a chiefs kids committee. That really restored my hope that, if it's all of our communities that have a say, then we will get to where we should be. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but Cindy, I wanted to ask you this. This is my question, because I have, looked at a whole bunch of different agreements on a whole bunch of different things, like self-government agreements. And so I've seen self-government agreements in territories where there's say an umbrella agreement, which, works out the broad scope of things, but then individual First Nations in that region can negotiate under that umbrella, and they might have something that's very First Nation specific for them. Is that at all possible for this kind of situation? Because I can't imagine every region is going to want the exact same thing.
No, and in fact, I feel it's required by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Let me tell you why. So, in part of this whole equation of stopping discrimination, the tribunal has said, look, you need to pay attention to the distinct cultures of kids and their distinct community circumstances. Well, how can one agreement take consideration of all the rich, diverse cultures, languages, and the distinct circumstances? We've always, at the Caring Society, felt like this had to be a master agreement below which no one would fall below. I think that's really important because, let's face it, Pam, we've had a history where Canada will look at regions that maybe don't have the same opportunities as others and try to give them less than everybody else. We can't have that anymore. And then have regional agreements that sit in there to address the distinct circumstances, the culture, and the language. I think it's really critical. Having said that, I want to just kind of emphasize one big piece, and that is that this success in this case has not always been negotiation. Had we relied on negotiation, we would not have had capital. We would have not had Jordan's principle off reserve. We would not have, in fact, had Jordan's principle for anyone other than children with disabilities. So this idea that we have to just wait for Canada to come back and they hold all the power, they don't. We can actually bring an order ourselves to the tribunal based on the good discussions that First Nations leadership have that set them up for success. And I think that's really important to know for your viewers. It's not all in Canada's hands. And I think that's why Canada was so desperate to sign this agreement, because that got them out of that place where someone else actually had the authority to order them to behave properly. They like to hold all the cards, and I don't think that's ever been good for our kids, and it's not something I'd personally accept. I don't know, Khelsilem, if you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, you raise a good point. I just wanted to also address something that we didn't really talk about that I think did come up a lot at the AFN as well, in terms of the comments and discussion. So one of the challenges with the negotiated settlement and the agreement is, to acknowledge where some of the discrimination does stem from is from this federal program that was administered by Indigenous Services Canada, and so this, that's a piece of it. And so there's an acknowledgement by the parties that part of this is dealing with that program and a few other matters. And so there was often a question that came up at the Chiefs Assembly around, well, what about off reserve? What about those that are living away from the community? There was a chief that I spoke to, and this is the case for some First Nations. So they are a First Nation where they were removed from their ancestral homelands, decades ago. They have reserve lands, but the reserve lands are in very remote parts of their province. And so today they might have 300, 400, 500 people registered with that First Nation, but they actually have no physical on-reserve community. Their people are spread out across other reserves, or they live in urban, or 90% might live in off-reserve. So they don't have like a physical reserve community because where their reserves are in very remote places without significant infrastructure, and Canada has not provided the resources for them to rebuild. And so, in those cases, they're saying, well, this agreement deals with on reserve. I don't have even an on reserve. So where does the conversation fit around the provincial aspect of this? And that's where I think there's another piece to this that's going to be important, which is how do you hold the provinces accountable? Because the federal cases and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal cases at the federal level deal with a lot of the federal discrimination, and they set a high watermark for what has been confirmed through the evidence that's been submitted. And there's an opportunity, I think, coming where First Nations could take what we've learned from the federal case and actually start applying it in a provincial context, and start holding provinces accountable, because the discrimination is also happening within the provincial systems as much as it is the federal systems.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to do, Pam, we've talked about it before. We actually had a huge win for kids at the tribunal, and that was the tribunal recognized First Nations children on and off reserve recognized by their nations for the purposes of Jordan's principle. That should apply to all the services. Like, children are being discriminated against based on whether they're on and off reserve, and we have many families that go on and off reserve. We've got kids in the same family. One of them was removed on reserve. It's a mess. The best solution is to adopt that definition. And I think that, picking up on Khelsilem's point, that's an opportunity that is ahead of us. Certainly the Caring Society is going to be pushing very hard for that.
It's so important, because I had a lot of questions that I didn't ask here, but there was a lot of questions about the class action, like the other class action for off-reserve people. And, so I'm glad Khelsilem raised, well, what about our off-reserve? Because First Nation jurisdiction, I would assume, is all of our citizens, not just those that are on reserve. Khelsilem, I'd love to hear from you a little bit more on that. If you want to, talk about, like, our jurisdiction doesn't stop at the reserve boundary.
Yeah, and so it's a really good question, and it doesn't. And I think that this is where, First Nations that are writing their child and family laws, and how they're going to construct those laws, they're going to affirm in those laws. So for example, I know of one First Nation that is currently developing their law, and they're looking at this concept of writing into their law that every child within their First Nation has the right to live up to their fullest potential. And then from that, whatever resources or supports are needed in order for their child to live up to their fullest potential is entitled to that. And fullest potential can look different. If it's somebody with special needs, or somebody has disabilities, or somebody has gifts in other ways, like, what is their fullest potential? And everybody deserves it. Everybody has that gift. So, that work is ongoing. But then it gets into this interaction between sort of the federal responsibilities and the provincial responsibilities. In BC, for example, where I'm most familiar, there's a number of First Nations that have slowly started to reclaim their jurisdiction, even without C92. So in BC, the way it's been explained to me, and Cindy and others will have more knowledge on this than I have, because it's not necessarily my field, but in BC, we sort of have, the way it's explained to me is we have like 5 levels that a First Nation can take on when it comes to the Child and Family Services program, in terms of taking that from the province. And so you sort of work your way through these levels of the depth of service, the kinds of service and responsibilities. And then the final level, or the 6th level, is getting to the place where provinces are doing apprehensions and actually moving in and doing investigations and then removing children forcefully because there's been a breakdown of some kind. So that's kind of the last level that a First Nation could go towards. Many First Nations choose not to get to the level because the risk and liability, provinces have these clauses written into their laws where they are able to act as a government without the risk or fear that they could be sued for liability. And this happens in a lot of different sort of public interest issues. Child welfare is one of them. And so there's these kinds of indemnities that exist within Canadian and provincial law that protects the provinces when they're acting in this way. And so there's reasons why that exists. There are some sort of reasons why that history of that law comes into play. But the reality is that there's a lot of First Nations that aren't ready to move from step 1 to step 5. It's going to take them time to build that capacity, to build that system, and to build the programs that are going to work. And it takes an iterative process. You can't just sort of take it over day one and then do the best job possible. And I think it's responsible for First Nations to recognize that. But that's the work that I think First Nations are wanting to do. We're wanting to reclaim jurisdiction. We're wanting to have the resources and the training. And this is, I think, where the work of the Caring Society and some of the other professional associations that are being created to help bring together, the experts and the leaders and the people who are on the ground doing the work to figure out and trade, knowledge and best practices amongst our nations to say, here's a program that we're doing to develop this, and here's a program to develop this. We have, just to give a hopeful note, because I like to be hopeful. It's Chief Bobby Joe from BC, who's been a leader on reconciliation. He always reminded me to leave people on a hopeful note. But we're opening 94 units of housing right now. We have people moving into my community. There was a apartment building that we built through funding from the provincial government that my nation also contributed to with land. 53% of the units are being allocated for elders, and then a number of units are being allocated for families that are within our child and family services programs, and then also for our young people who are aging out of care, so that they have a home that they can move into once they age out as well. So they're literally, I think people are getting selected this week and are moving in the next few weeks and stuff. So it's going to be a slow process, but very exciting project where we have the resources to say, if you're aging out of care, we don't want you to end up having to move thousands of kilometers away from our territory because our city is so expensive. You get to stay in community and be connected to your relatives and your family that are here and their relationships that you've built here. Be connected to our elders and our longhouse and our traditions and our culture. But also for our families, if you have an aunt or uncle is saying, I'll take my nieces and nephew, or my cousin's kids, or my niece and nephew, I'll take them and raise them with my kids. But I can't afford, a 4-bedroom offers, or I want to be able to live in community so I can keep, pay affordable rent. Those things are now happening in my community and a few other First Nations communities. So, I think that there's a lot of really powerful, really impactful work where, at the end of the day, where we want to get to is we want to get to a place where we have children who have been gone through these systems, and they're looking back at it and saying, I'm really grateful that the leaders fought for me and fought for me to have the best possible program. We do not want any more of our children to stand up and say, I had a horrible experience. I was traumatized beyond belief because of the system. We don't want to be there anymore. We want to get to a place where our children are thanking us who are alive today for the decisions that we made that made their lives better, 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now.
I'm so glad to hear this. And, if you'll indulge me, Cindy, I want to ask you a question about agencies, because I think it's important we make some clarifications. Yeah. But Hadley, I can't help but go back to UNDRIP. Is the jurisdiction of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous governments limited by the reserve boundaries? I just don't see anything in UNDRIP, or even, I'd have to question whether that's in Section 35 that we can only govern in those small reserve boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely not. We can do UNDRIP, we can do Section 35, we could also do C92. You can look at the Hansard notes, which is the debate before C92 became law. And you have the deputy minister at the time being asked directly, is this territorial jurisdiction? So is this bounded by reserve boundaries or any other boundary? Or is this personal jurisdiction? Is this jurisdiction that follows children and families and belongs to them wherever they go? Just like there's jurisdiction where when Canadians go abroad, there's certain things that follow. And the very clear answer was this is intended to be personal jurisdiction for all the reasons pointed out here. It just wouldn't make sense to end at the boundaries of the reserve. So I think that's really important, and I'll quickly point out. I mean, you see in negotiation tables again that give and take where through funding that can get watered down because of what's being offered on reserve and off reserve. But yeah.
I'll just add to that too. I think one of the really interesting things around the court case that happened where Quebec challenged, C-92 and the Supreme Court case and the arguments and the plaintiffs that put together on that. So, one of the basis or one of the arguments that was put forward in that was that you have sort of the Canadian pluralistic structure of the provinces and the federal government, and sort of this delineation of powers between what the provinces are responsible for and the feds, and then where there's overlap. One of the arguments that was put forward in that case by First Nations was that when you look at the constitutional framework, it does not specify who is actually responsible for First Nations child welfare jurisdiction, that it's an inherent jurisdiction of First Nations because nobody else has claimed it. It's always ours. It's always been ours. And so we are the inherent rights holders of this jurisdiction, and that we as First Nations have the right to sort of manage these affairs. That was never, that was a universal sort of concept of like our children. If you're First Nations child, if you are a citizen or a person of a nation, you are under that jurisdiction. So this geography issue that was created through separate discriminatory legislation like the Indian Act between on reserve, off reserve, that all comes later. That comes after the underlying fact of this existed prior to Canada existing, and as such, within the meaning of Section 35, it is an Aboriginal right, and it is an area of the law that both the feds and the province don't have anything to point to within the Canadian Constitution that says this is their responsibility. So it was challenging sort of Quebec's assertion that they had the right as a province to sort of insert themselves into this and that there was overreach by the federal government. But what was interesting about it is that the federal court did actually agree with sort of this concept that underlying the lack of, or underlying is the jurisdiction that's always been there, that we've never given up, and that is what is being affirmed and acknowledged and recognized, and that includes everybody, no matter where you live, if you belong to a First Nation.
So important. And Cindy, just before we end, I wanted to ask you about agencies because there's been some very negative commentary, again, media, that you were just fighting against this agreement because you want all the money to go to child welfare agencies and you don't care about First Nations. But then I just heard Khelsilem say, well, you know what? Different First Nations are on a different journey and a different time frame. Some people might be ready right now to enact their own laws and assume all of that jurisdiction, whereas others have very good relationships with their local, it could be a First Nations child welfare agency, and they're like, you know what, they're doing work. I don't want to do what they're doing. And others might say, well, this is a staggered approach. Can you just speak to the issue of agencies? Because I think sometimes they're a bit vilified.
Yeah, I think that this was an unfortunate narrative of Canada that was very effective. Canada did not want to have the spotlight on itself, i.e., we are the ones responsible for discrimination and they need to be held accountable for that. So what they did quite successfully is they said, oh, well, the problem actually isn't our discrimination. It's not the federal government. The problem is that you have these folks working in community doing their best to try and keep families together and are woefully underfunded. They're actually the problem. It's the decisions that they're making that are the problem. And you need to get rid of them or you need to erode them. And I felt that was such a disrespectful process for the federal government to undertake. Number one, you need to understand these agencies are established by First Nations. You don't even get off the ground unless there is authority from the nation or nations to provide those services. Because most leaders are too busy leading to be offering direct services. And they appreciate, and over the years, this whole vision of self-government that I've seen has been about really empowering our own people to be able to do these important work. And let's face it, child welfare is tough, right? It's often easier in the back seat when you think, well, there's got to be an easier way. But a lot of our families are seriously traumatized. We got the opioids addiction, we got profound poverty, and child welfare is trying to come in that ambit, but it can't do it on its own. So I just want to say that, there's never been a money grab by agencies that I've seen. It's always been about they understood that they're interim measures towards something else that First Nations are working towards. But they do need to be there until that capacity is there and the jurisdiction is there from the nation and they want to take it over. So I just personally want to just thank all those people on the front lines who are working with our kids, because I think that often they don't get the recognition that they deserve. And are there some bad apples? Yes, but there are bad apples in every profession. And most people are working really day and night and doing it because they love the kids. That's been my experience.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. And unless, you have some closing remarks or anything else you want to say, I want to give you that opportunity before we close out. I think you've all done
This is not about compensation. I thought it was so unfortunate that the compensation stuff got confused with the debate that leaders were having at that meeting. And, I was heartbroken to see the representative plaintiffs of the class action. By the way, there are no representative plaintiffs at the tribunal. Like, that's a different type of proceeding. So if you heard that actually can't happen at the tribunal. Representative plaintiffs are part of a class action. And these poor folks, like, they're good people who have experienced a lot of trauma. And they were of the understanding that the chiefs were voting again on their compensation. That was never on the agenda. These things are two separate things. That's off being dealt with by class action lawyers. The government of Canada has already paid that money. It's up to those class action lawyers to get the money out the door to people. So just to make sure everybody sleeps comfortably tonight, know that is a separate procedure. What we're doing now is hopefully stopping there ever being more victims of Canada's discrimination. And that's being done through the Human Rights Tribunal and now through this work directed by First Nations leadership.
So glad you added that, because of all the questions I get about compensation. Oh, the chiefs voted down our compensation. And it's like, no, that's not what happened. Hadley, anything else that you think we need to know before we sign off?
I think it's been said eloquently and
awesome. Okay, chairperson.
No, I just really want to thank my colleagues who joined me on this, and Cindy and Hadley and Pam. Really appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion and just share the information. We just have to get the information out there, and I think it's really important. For any of your viewers, if you're First Nations, like I highly encourage you to contact your chief and say, are you going to these AFN meetings? Did you send a proxy or were you there? There's 600 potential votes at the AFN, and there was 400 and something that were there. There's a lot of chiefs that couldn't make it for whatever reason. That's fine. But for the ones that aren't aware or aren't in the know, they need their community sort of asking them, like, are you going to go, or send somebody to go, because these decisions are important. And at the end of the day, decisions are made by the people who show up. So we have to be there for the kids.
Well, thank you thank you to all of you. You all bring a different kind of expertise, and I just don't have the ability to answer all of these questions for all of the questions that I get. And I know there will be many more people that watch the recording of this, and I'll make sure to upload it to the podcast for all the podcasters. so that people get as much information as possible. And hopefully, if we're in another situation where there could be another vote, I hope I can invite you all back and get your insights and analysis so that we can help do our part keeping all the grassroots people and leadership too informed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank
you,
you.
everybody. Khelsilem, Hadley.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We are signing off, and the recording will be uploaded instantaneously. Have a good night.